I don't want to bore everyone with too many details and stats and things. I think, look, let me just speak to you about this topic. I think it is, Michelle, maybe you can leave it on. I'm just going to go through it with the notes that I've prepared myself. But, you can keep that, certainly the PowerPoint presentation, and just have it as a reference for yourselves going forward. So what I wanted to just chat about is something very topical at the moment, distressed sales. Let me just give me a second. Just hold on here. All right. So, distressed sales and shortfall sales, now I call these things assisted sale programs, which is taking the current market into account, very topical. You found over the last couple of years, with the direct impact of interest rates having gone up, you find a lot of property owners are under pressure with bond repayments. Now, historically, forced sales were a thing, but you find, or we've certainly found, having done some research since COVID, coming off a low base where interest rates were up to where they were now at the moment. I mean, now interest rates sitting at 11.75%. That's almost a 10, 15-year high. Now, what happens with that is straight away financial pressure gets put onto homeowners, as well as not just bond repayments, but everything else, the economy and global politics. We find things like food prices, fuels going up, electricity, even though we pay for electricity and we don't get it. All of those have a big impact on consumers, where they're under pressure to maintain bond repayments. Now, that affects not just the lower income groups. We find that this affects income groups from the lower end of the market right to the high net worth individuals. And, you would think that these guys, the high net worth individuals, aren't possibly affected that much by increases in rates. But if you look at a bond of, say, $1 million in the good times where the rates were low, compared to the rates that we have now for a bond repayment, that's an increase of 3,000 Rand roughly. Now, if you're taking a bond of about 2.5 million, just as an average, in the good days, and compared to the repayments now, that could be 8, 9, 10,000 Rand a month extra. Now, that's a big knock to the consumer's pocket out there. You can imagine these guys, they're still trying to maintain their standard of living, and it just gets tougher and tougher with those repayments. So, what's happened as a direct result of that is these banks have seen this trend where consumers are possibly starting to fall short on their bond installments, keeping up with the repayments. So what these banks have done is they've all, and it's not just single, it's all the main banks, all the major banks, they've come up with these assistance programs in order to try and help the consumer out there just to maintain their bond installments. Now, there's different types of, call it assisted sale programs that these banks have come up with. So assisted sales, just the plain ordinary vanilla assisted sale, is the entry-level step towards trying to help save a consumer from losing his home. The other one is shortfall sales, and then you've got sheriff sales and executions. And built into that is also a thing called properties in possession. But if I can just start with the assisted sales example first, so what these banks have done with assisted sales, and I think this is also just to jump in where you'd probably be doing your sellers a big service. Ask your sellers, you want to try and give your sellers the best service that you can. So if you've got any deal that you think the seller is possibly a bit distressed, and it's not yet a forced sale or a shortfall sale, but he has to sell it because he might have a problem maintaining his bond installments, I think it would be a good idea for all of you to certainly ask your sellers, listen, how is it going with their bond installments? Are they up to date? Are there problems? Are there shortfalls? Because these assisted sale programs that the banks have proposed, what that offers is that the sellers can go to the banks and say, before the banks have to start sending out letters of demand and summons to the property owners, it's a good idea for these sellers, if they see they're under financial pressure, to go and speak to their bank and say, listen, they're having difficulties for whatever the reason might be. Can the bank help them sell their property? So what these banks have done is and it's across all the banks, they call it the assisted sale. So different banks have got different names for it. Standard Bank calls it easy sell. FNB, for instance, calls it the quick sell process. But basically what it means is the banks have a panel of agents, estate agents, that they then market that property out to, in the hope that these estate agents can find willing buyers, obviously at a market-related price for the property, because that's what you want for the homeowner. You don't want it to be sold for less, really, what is owing to the bank. So these assisted sale programs use estate agents out there to find, hopefully, buyers that qualify for bonds in turn to buy the property. But the idea is there that you sell the property on the open market at a market-related price, hopefully enough to cover the amount that the seller owes to the bank, and the seller can then walk away, hopefully with a bit of cash in his pocket, bearing in mind still they have to still pay rates and the commission, the estate agent's commission. So that's always a thing that has to be factored in. These banks are very clever when it comes to the commission, because I know what they do is when it gets to a stage where it's an assisted sale or possibly a shortfall sale, especially with the shortfall sales, what they do is they put a cap on the estate agent's commission, which is tough, because you work hard to find the buyers out there. But these banks, in terms of their bond documents, they take first bite of the apple. So they just want to make sure they get their money back, what's owing on the bond. And I've seen it. They actually, if there's an offer on the table from an assisted sale that you as the agent have found a willing buyer for to buy the property, and if there's just enough, say now, from the sale price in terms of the current market value to cover the amount outstanding on the bond, the bank does, and they do that. I've seen it. They tell the agent, listen, they need X amount to settle the bond. And unfortunately, they get the agent to even cap or to cut the commission. Assisted sales really is the first step in this whole distressed sale process. The next one is shortfall sales. Now, shortfall sales is a bit more serious, because straight away, if you've got money owing to the bank in terms of the bond for more than what the seller can sell the property for, there's going to be a shortfall. Now, this whole process gets a bit more serious, because what the bank does is they look at the sale price that you as the agent might have been able to find a buyer for the property. And depending on the amount of the shortfall, now the banks take all of this on a case-by-case basis. They look at each case on its own merits, and depending on the amount of the shortfall, as well as the conduct of the seller, the consumer, they look to see if the consumer has been a genuine or made a genuine effort to maintain bond repayments, if he's been engaging with the bank to tell them, listen, he's possibly under pressure, he might have been retrenched, or he's had a salary cut. We found after COVID there was a lot of that. The bank looks at all these issues and then decides whether they're going to accept an acknowledgement of debt from the homeowner. So basically what the bank does, if they get an offer to purchase on the table, which is market related, it possibly might be a bit low, because, as we all know, the market's a bit tight at the moment. But what the bank would then do is they look at the offer on the table and they then work out the shortfall still owing, bearing in mind there's still interest. That's how these banks make all their money. They charge interest on these home loans. If the amount of the shortfall is not too much, they obviously also consider the homeowner's financial position. It's pointless getting the homeowner to sign an acknowledgement of debt if the homeowner doesn't have a job. There's no way that acknowledgement of debt is going to be serviced. Even though the banks do, in cases like that, consider giving the homeowner a possible discount on the shortfall amount, just as an incentive to try and offload and sell the property sooner rather than later, because the longer the seller keeps the property, the worse the situation could possibly get. The interests just add up for the bank loses money. On the seller's side, there's a chance that the seller's possibly not even paying rates. So even the rates amounts owing to the council just go up and up and up. So what the banks do is they try and sweeten the deal to try and persuade these sellers to sign the acknowledgement of debt by giving them a possible discount on the shortfall amount, just with a view to try and say, sign the acknowledgement of debt. And they even get people to pay these acknowledgements of debts off on a debit order, possibly interest-free for a period of however long the consumer, the homeowner, would need. 10 years. I mean, it sounds a long time, but it might be beneficial to the property owner to offload his property and just be left having to service an acknowledgement of debt. As a matter of interest, actually, the bond loan agreement documents that the bank or that the buyers sign with us as the bond attorneys actually allow there's a point here. You can see the last point on that bullet point there on the screen. Let me just close this. That's popped up here. The banks have a 30-year prescription period built into the bond for shortfall amounts. So what that means is if the seller does sign an acknowledgement of debt in favor of the bank, there's a 30-year prescription period for the bank to recover that shortfall amount. Now, that's a long time. So, it's quite a serious thing, acknowledgement of debts, but the banks do try and help these consumers by, as I said, possibly giving them discounts on the shortfall amounts. So moving on from shortfall amounts, the next step in the process is something that's called a sheriff's sale and execution. Now, this is really the last resort. Once you've gone through the process of the assisted sale and the shortfall sale, and also bearing in mind, what these banks do is before it gets to the sale and execution stage, they also try and help these consumers. There's been a lot of case law recently in the news. You hear these stories about the banks foreclosing on people's properties, and then the homeowner is out in the street. So there's been a lot of bad press in the newspapers and on media where banks are taken to task for disregarding the homeowners, the consumers' primary residence, if that's the only place that they've got to live, and throwing them out into the street. Now, what these banks try and do first is they're genuinely trying to help these consumers. What they're happy to do is, if a homeowner's possibly got a term of 5 years left on the bond for the repayment and suddenly falls on bad times, what the banks are happy to do is to restructure that loan back over that 20-year term period for the loan, or possibly even 30 years. The effect of that would be to drop the monthly bond installments, just in an effort to try and help that consumer make the monthly bond installment payments. They sometimes also give these consumers a payment holiday. It all depends on the homeowner's personal circumstances. If they've been possibly retrenched, or they've had a salary cut, or whatever the case might be, these banks try and restructure the loan debt to try and help the consumer maintain the bond installments, and through that keep the property. That's as a direct result of all the cases that have come out recently, court cases, all the way up to the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Court, where the courts have actually come down hard on the banks, and they've said, on the one side, you've got the rights and the interests of the banks that have got to be taken into consideration, but you've also got to weigh that up against the housing consumer's right to housing. So in terms of our constitution, every person has got the right to housing. So what the courts have done is, they obviously, on a case-by-case basis, they weigh these two rights up, and depending on what they find, they then make a court order depending on what they see is just and equitable for the housing consumer. That's always the main point that they've got to look at. So getting to sheriff sales and executions, if everything else fails, if you don't manage to get a sale based on current market value for the property, if the person doesn't have a job, can't sign an acknowledgement of debt for the bank, what would then happen is, what the banks do is they apply to the High Court, for an order to attach and sell that property at a sheriff's sale and execution. So now that's done by public auction. It's not just a private sale. They've gone through that whole process where they've tried to put it out to market to find a buyer who's happy to pay market-related prices. But what they then do is they put it out to a sheriff's auction. Now, what these banks do is they generally automatically apply to court for an order to sell the homeowner's movable assets, cars, furniture, as well as the immovable property. Now, if you think about it, cars and furniture doesn't really hold much value for the bank. If you sell those, they won't really get much money out of it in order to settle the money owing in terms of the bond and the interest. And that's what they need. So most of the time, these banks, they're allowed to sell the movables for these homeowners, but generally they ask the court to go straight to the immovable property, the house itself, and to get an order to sell the house. Now, I used to years ago do properties and do these sales and executions where at a sale and execution, this is now where the court has granted the sale and execution. And what the sheriff of the High Court does is he then advertises the property for sale. And then what happens is on the date of the auction, people can come and bid. And years ago, you found, and you possibly still hear these stories, but it was rife years ago where you found if you attended a sheriff's sale and execution for a property, you could pick up a property for peanuts, way below the market value, way below the municipal value. And that really left, that didn't do anyone any favors because the bank lost money, the homeowner lost money, and you were lucky enough to pick up a property worth possibly $1 million for 100 or 200,000. What the banks have done now, though, is since about 10 years ago, the banks, together with the courts, they've set reserve prices on these properties. So if the bank is forced to go to the High Court to ask for an order where property can be sold at a sheriff's auction, what the banks and the courts do is they set a reserve price on these properties. Now, the reserve price is really, if you think about it, the amount outstanding on the bond together with the rates, because what the banks also then do is they make sure they get a copy of the rates figures owing to the council by the homeowner. And then they know what they need to set the reserve price at for the property. So in that way, they're looking after the homeowner, because hopefully if at the sheriff's auction, the property gets sold for more than that reserve price, there could still be a bit of money in the pocket for the homeowner. Hopefully, it all depends at an auction. You never know what's going to happen there. So these reserve prices that the courts have set together with the banks is actually also aimed at protecting the consumer's rights. However, at a sheriff's auction, you never know what's going to happen. You might have no one interested in the property. The property by that stage might be run down. It probably hasn't been maintained and no one's interested, in a tough market. People might not qualify for bonds. So, if it happens at a sheriff's auction where no one buys the property or no one bids certainly up to the reserve price, then the bank's not going to accept that offer, even the highest offer. If it's below the reserve price, the bank's not going to be happy to accept that. What the banks then do is they then buy the property back in themselves. Now, we call this a property in possession. It's a bank property in possession sale where the bank actually then buys the property back. The idea behind that is what these banks then do is they hold onto this property and they then keep on marketing this property in the hope that in the future sometime there could be, the market improves and possibly they could find buyers that are willing to pay market-related prices for the property and then take it off the bank's hands. But again, it's not ideal, because what these banks do is they have to then pay holding costs for these properties, and they don't want to build up a whole database or a whole property portfolio rather of properties that they are now holding. They want to offload these properties. There's still the debt that the seller had owed. It's not ideal for the bank from a business sense. So if you have a situation where there's a property in possession, these banks then try and quickly put that out to market as quickly as they can using their panel of estate agents and just try and find buyers for that property as quickly as possible. I'm just looking at how we're doing for time. I've got 10 minutes. Okay. Again, so apologies, but I think just to wrap off, I touched on it earlier. There are also a lot of cases recently. So in years gone past, in the media and the press, and various banks come to mind. Nedbank, I know they've been hauled over the coals for evicting people from houses that have been sold. Investec, all the banks. So, recently there have been a lot of cases where, if it becomes a sale and execution, what the courts now do is they don't just grant the bank's request an order that the property can be sold at a share of sale and execution. They go through the whole background and the history of each matter, and they ask, how much is the debt? What led to the debt existing? For instance, if the homeowner was retrenched, had a good job, possibly supports his or her own whole family. They look at all of those factors, and possibly also the willingness of the consumer to pay off the home loan. It's different if the consumer just doesn't care and isn't paying regardless of all the letters of request and letters of demand that the banks have sent them. If there's the genuine attempt by the homeowner to want to pay off the home loan, the banks take all this into consideration. And what the banks might then do is, instead of making an order where they just grant the order that the bank is asking to have the property sold in execution, they allow the property to be attached, so grant an attachment interdict against the property. And on a daily basis, this happens where the High Court sends a whole list of these attachment interdicts to the deeds office. And straight away, what the deeds office does is they note that attachment interdict against the property in the deeds office, which means that you can't sell that property. The seller can't sell that property before that attachment interdict has been uplifted. In this way, the bank is really protected from that property being sold and not getting its money back. But aside from that, what the courts also do is they can make any order, aside from possibly granting a sale and execution, they can also make an order to hold over that sale and execution for 6 months, a year. And their thinking is possibly there, if they have the situation where a homeowner had been retrenched but has possibly found a job again and can maintain and continue bond installments, making those payments, the court is very quick to look after and protect the rights of the consumer. So the courts could say, okay, fine, they'll grant the order that the bank may sell the property in execution, but they then postpone that order, giving that homeowner, the consumer, time to build up their job again. If they've just recently been employed again, got a job, start getting their credit profile right, start making payments towards the bank again, possibly pay off the arrears on the home loan. Hopefully in that way, what the banks are trying to do is help save the houses for these consumers. Again, coming back to the Consumer Protection Act, that's got overriding sort of an issue that the banks look at in overriding any other rights that the banks might have for their own losses, if you can call it that. So these banks certainly, or rather the courts certainly, are trying to help the consumers out there that have fallen on hard times when they make these orders of attaching properties and having them sold in execution, because that's really a lose-lose for everyone. So we found in recent cases the courts try and manage that whole situation where they try and save the primary residence for people. If it doesn't work, then some people take a chance. They say they have to live in this house. They've got a new job, but they can't move. It's been their family home. There's been cases like that. It'll cause them mental and emotional stress if they have to move out of the house. But there's a case particularly where a court said it doesn't work like that. This debtor, the homeowner, can easily find somewhere else to rent. The house has to be sold in order to get the money back to the bank so the bank can recover its losses. So the banks are still entitled to monies that they are owed, and the courts sort of then try and take an equitable approach on both sides when they make these orders when it comes to property sales and executions. So I think that's pretty much it. I won't keep you all much longer. Again, apologies for my delayed start. I think, as I said earlier, though, just to offer the best service to your clients. So when it comes to sellers particularly, I think it'd probably be a good idea to ask them up front certainly is a properly bonded. But I think don't just leave it at that. Ask them, are they up to date with the bond? Are they under pressure to sell? Because we all know these sellers are trying to get the best price that they can, but they might be losing or not keeping an eye on the bigger picture. If they holding out and the pressure is building on them to pay their bond installments, and they're holding out for what they think is a price that they should be getting for the place, they might have problems further down the line with acknowledgements of debt and interest that might be added onto the bond and to the acknowledgement of debt. So it might be a good idea to try and educate these sellers to say, rather quit while they're ahead. If they're looking to downscale because of financial reasons, it could be anything, rather than have to possibly get bad credit listings and have to pay off acknowledgements of debts with interest. I think you'd probably be doing your sellers a bigger service to try and say, listen, cut your losses before it gets too late if they are under financial pressure. It obviously depends from seller to seller. Some might be downsizing for family reasons. It could be anything, but I think it's probably a good idea, especially in this market, to ask your seller clients those questions: why they're selling, what's the purpose, and if it is a sale that's under pressure, there's definitely some programs within the banks that you could refer the clients to that can help them offload their property with hopefully still with some cash in their pocket. So, I think that's it from me. Look, very topical at this point in time, as I said, with the market we're in. Hopefully after the elections, interest rates will go down. I think that's probably the biggest impact on the increase in distressed sales that we've seen over the last couple of years. But who knows? We don't know what's going to happen in elections, but I think keep in mind foreclosure sales are always a thing. So it's, as I said, key thing is just find out from your sellers why they're selling, and there's definitely programs out there to help them. All right. Thanks, everyone. I hope that added a bit of insight and value to what you found out there in the market. And all the best. Good luck.
Thanks, Carl. I actually found your stats very interesting.
Yeah, they are. It's always some, changes from time to time. It does. There's some real value that you can find in that. So absolutely, keep those, look at it. And also, if there's any questions that you've got, we are on ourselves talking about STBB. We are on the banks panels for the assisted sales. So if there's any clients that you want to refer to us, possibly we can refer them to the banks and we can get them help, hopefully, if that's what they're looking for. But happy to help.
Super. Thank you so much, Carl. Much appreciated.
Cheers, Michelle. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.